I'd like to start with Gunn Britt. Gunn Britt, you have been deeply involved in the Convention on Biodiversity. And the Convention on Biodiversity is a UN process for securing all the species on this planet, and it's setting targets and getting nations to connect to that. And one of the challenges that you face, of course, is that the solutions are bigger than just national policies. The solutions are who do you engage and how do you inspire others to actually participate. And as we said in the beginning, over a third of the Earth, over 80% of the biodiversity are on the territories of Indigenous peoples, which is why you've been so involved. Can you frame for the audience the role that Indigenous peoples have to play in terms of the Convention on Biodiversity and the next meeting, which takes place in China in 2020?
Thank you. Oy, that was very loud. Yes, I would like to start off with setting the stage starting from my home community. I was, as you said, born and raised in a Saami community at the Varanger Fjord, north in Norway. The only fjord in Norway with the opening towards the east. And people have lived here since the ice retreated 13,000 years ago. But compared to Joe, that is relatively short, I realize. My community is on 70 degrees north, and only the innermost shallow part of the fjord freezes during winter. We hold a very strong and proud Saami identity in my community, squeezed between the stronger Norwegian-influenced and more coastal towns of Kirkenes and Vadsø, for those who are familiar with that. It is no coincidence that our culture is strong and still thriving in this community. That is largely due to the vast richness of the fjords and the Barents Sea, and the adjacent Varanger Peninsula, holding reindeer pastures and a source for other subsistence activities, part of which since 2006 has been recognized as a national park. And I'm saying this because I think this demonstrates a strong relationship between the nature and culture. A relationship the Indigenous peoples working with the Convention on Biological Diversity is promoting to be among the elements in the new post-2020 framework of the Convention of Biological Diversity, which is now being developed and is to be adopted in Kunming in China just a year from now. So you can imagine that it's only a year, so we have a much of work to get done by then. And the relationship is also, as mentioned in the introduction, recognized in the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, when it's in its recently released global assessment said that lands traditionally owned, managed, used, or occupied by Indigenous peoples cover approximately 35% of formal protected areas and approximately 35% of all remaining terrestrial areas with very low human intervention. This affirms the central role and vital contributions of Indigenous peoples and local communities to fulfilling the goals of the Convention, which is to reduce the biodiversity loss. Indigenous peoples' use of lands and waters is part of the solution to reduce land degradation and loss of nature. And the ongoing discussion on the post-2020 framework is an opportunity to address this. And I encourage all the parties in this room to keep this in mind as we continue now with the discussions towards Kunming. Because we are at a very critical moment of global transition, demanding the best of ourselves and the best of all other actors towards restoring balance in humans' relationship with nature. For Indigenous peoples, this means an abiding self-determination, renewal of our spiritual and cultural values to defend living nature, sacred spaces, and our territories from destruction. Building on this foundation, and with our rights fully recognized and protected in the post-2020 biodiversity framework, we can be strategic partners permanent partners with governments, supporting the collective action of Indigenous peoples and securing our rights to lands, waters, territories, and resources can be among the most effective ways to make rapid progress in reversing biodiversity loss and moving towards the 2050 vision for biodiversity, which is living in harmony with nature. And since we are in the Arctic audience, Mr. Chair, I have to also add that maybe we should look to Arctic Council, and that could serve as a model for involving and empowering Indigenous peoples, because this is an international body where the Indigenous peoples sit at the same table as the 8 Arctic states and have equal say, at least almost. Well, I feel we have very informal powers. So this has, I think, this have contributed to better outcomes from Arctic Council, at least seen from our perspective. So a good international framework for reducing biodiversity loss for living in harmony with nature. I hope this would commit the parties to the convention, including the countries where the Saami people live, to protect nature and culture. Because to protect nature, you have to protect the culture as well. And if you want to protect the Saami people and our culture, you have to protect the nature as well.
Thank you, Gunn. Is it just a follow-up question? The targets that are being discussed are 30% of the Earth being protected by 2030. Is that correct? No, yes? They're in discussion. There's some big numbers. There's a movement called Half Earth. I mean, I have a very hard time imagining 30% of the ocean being healthy and 70% being unhealthy as a target, but there's a discussion about these different targets. And my question is simply, is it possible to achieve that without the engagement of Indigenous peoples in the territories that they control and they are guardians of?
No. But also, I think, as I said, if you want to protect nature, you also have to protect the cultures. But we also have to make sure when discussing protection of nature or protected areas, you have to do that in a way that doesn't exclude the Indigenous peoples, but ensure that they are involved in the management and can continue their traditional activities. In the past, we have seen many examples of the opposite. So that is an important element, for me, more than the numbers, because I'm not really good at numbers.
Thank you. I would just, a little anecdote, just add, not about the Arctic, but about the tropics. There is a very significant part of the Amazon that has been established as indigenous protected areas, particularly in Brazil. But there has to be the political will in the countries to uphold those designations. And right now in the Amazon, which is a very important part of the solution for capturing carbon and biodiversity, the leadership of the country is saying, we understand there's an indigenous protected area, but we're going to look the other way while extractive industries move in and take timber, fish, and minerals. And so it's very important that we not only have the designations, but that we also have the support and the implementation of the legal rights. So, Joe, you have been involved in this movement for almost 3 decades, maybe more. Obviously, your lineage goes back tens of thousands of years, so that you've been shaped by that. Could you talk a little bit about your own engagement with the government of Australia in securing Aboriginal rights and lands?
Thanks, Peter. I will firstly just acknowledge those Indigenous people attending here today, and also the other members as well, and thank you all for allowing me to come here. Just a bit of context to Peter's question. Obviously, Indigenous people in Australia have been occupying that continent for a long time. The British arrived in 1788, but they didn't colonise Northern Australia until about 120 to 150 years ago. So in global terms, it's relatively recent. Land rights in Northern Australia started around the 1940s, really as a reaction to colonial pursuits for grazing in particular. and other extractive industries thereafter, and equal wages, because Indigenous people were working for no wages. Shortly thereafter, in the 1970s, particularly in the Northern Territory of Northern Australia, where I come from, inquiries into land rights led to establishment of legislation, and that started a legal process of getting lands and waters back for Indigenous people. I came along obviously a long time after, and I started working with Indigenous people in a post-determination conversation to talk about what Indigenous people were going to do with their lands and waters after they got those lands and waters back. There was enormous pressure, particularly from extractive industries, to enter those lands and to open up mines in particular. And so the conversation that Indigenous people commenced was really about developing resilience, not just in relation and reactions to extractive industries, but also the demise of language, culture, and the ability to practice those traditions that have been practiced for tens of thousands of years. And out of that, in the 1990s, emerged what we call a caring for country movement. And the caring for country movement really was a renaissance that led to mobilising large numbers, particularly of young people, young men and women, under the auspices and leadership of our senior people, to organise themselves and to start looking after their countries, and particularly when there were missions and mission settlements established after the frontier violence started and went through much of Northern Australia. Missions gathered Indigenous people up, and so this was a reaction to some of the mission settlements as well. The Caring for Country movement started a discussion in Northern Australia in particular, and the motivation had led to and spread right throughout Australia. And so much of my career has been working with Indigenous people in the north, in the remote north. And for example, a place that I used to go to work used to be a 17-hour direct drive from Darwin, which is the capital of the Northern Territory. And we didn't have speed limits then, so we used to basically drive as fast as we could, but it still took us 17 hours. And that was one of the most remote places that we could get to that were occupied by Indigenous people looking after these vast, massive territories. These rangers, we called Indigenous people who were looking after their, or guardians looking after their country, as rangers. And that concept came about because there was a very need to articulate the importance of Indigenous people looking after their country in an Aboriginal English way, where English-speaking people could understand the nature of what Indigenous people were talking about. So the Caring for Country movement was born in the 1990s, and Indigenous protected areas started to become very important, and particularly the need to enshrine lesser forms of protected areas on the National Reserve System of Australia, so not just because Australia could meet its international obligations to protect a portion of its country in protected areas, but more so because Indigenous people wanted to ensure that their special places were protected and there were places of natural and cultural significance registered and looked after in the national estate. So that renaissance took place. It grew out of Northern Australia. It was dealing with both terrestrial and marine resources. And then I commenced an organisation, as Peter alluded to, the North Australian Indigenous Land and Sea Management Alliance, which really brought Indigenous people together across the north to think about those questions of what do we do with that country and how do we find novel and very culturally acceptable ways of forming livelihoods. And one of the ways that we did that, as Peter alluded to, was to reinstate traditional fire regimes and generate credits to sell, and that would basically support and underwrite Indigenous people on their country. Importantly, it wasn't just about the environmental and conservation aspects, it was very much about the cultural and customary management aspects of that work as well. And so a lot of work went into reinvigorating language and culture and traditions, getting young people back onto their traditional estates, and to reinvigorate those practices. And so that's been going on for the last 20 odd years in Northern Australia. It's very successful, provides agency for a lot of Indigenous people, and the way that they interact with the Australian government is the Australian government has now recognised the importance of Indigenous rangers, and they have committed to supporting Indigenous rangers. They support it to the tune of about 100 million a year now, and they look after vast amounts of territories through the Indigenous Protected Areas program. A lot of that was done with the work that we did at Nailsmore and the work that we collectively did in Northern Australia, and that led to a lot of the areas in the north that were relatively intact, relatively undisturbed, places that were very special in terms of global significance of rock art, particularly in the central and western Arnhem Land regions of Northern Australia. And those places are now being protected and looked after and cared for by reinstating Indigenous people back into the landscape. So, Peter, just in terms of your question, I think what's happened in Australia is that we've seen a developing state that is the Indigenous people who are living sometimes in third world situations, residing in a first world nation, finding their own futures, and doing that by having the political space and the capacity and the agency and the advocacy to be able to articulate their concerns to the Australian government.
Thank you very much, Joe. I should just point out that Joe mentioned the rock art, and we were recently in Arnhem Land and looking at this beautiful rock art, and what was most stunning was there was an animal that went extinct called the Tasmanian tiger. And looking at the rock art, we found drawings of the Tasmanian tiger on the walls that were painted many, many, many centuries ago that are still there. The art's there, the animals are gone. Jennifer, so you lead, you've been involved in the policy discussions for the UN. You've been deeply involved with TEBA and the extraordinary organization in the Philippines working on Indigenous rights. You lead all the policy work at Tero. Yet when I spoke to you about what you want to talk about, you said you wanted to share some of the lessons that your grandmother taught you, you would like to pass on to your children and to other Indigenous peoples. So would you just touch upon that and frame it in terms of this topic?
Yeah. Well, maybe I stick with one lesson because we're running out of time. But I wanted to tell everyone a story about my grandmother and one of the most important lessons that she imparted to us, her grandchildren. And it's this concept of inayan. You know, she'd always say, inayan, adim ikansa, inayan. Just to tell us that we're not supposed to be doing things that are wasteful, or things that could harm the environment, or things that could harm the collective, selfish things that end up harming the harmony within the community. And maybe I tell you about an example which happened recently in my community, where this value came, it came to the fore. So there was a government agency that came to our community once, and they really wanted to develop tourism within our community. And they fenced off this little lake. It's a small lake because we're in a high mountain community. And they wanted to have horses and canoes, and basically excluding the community. They fenced it and excluded us. And all the old women within the community started saying, inayan, adi na mabali na ikansa. So they shouldn't do that because this is a sacred site within our community, and it's a watershed. And so the women mobilized themselves because, according to our values, people are not supposed to be doing that. They're not supposed to be harming the collective and the culture of the Indigenous peoples. And so they managed to dismantle the fences, and eventually this government agency left. And again, it's because the community clung to this cultural value. And when you look at it, when you zoom out a little bit, there's evidence that would show that it's these cultural values that actually keep many parts of the Philippines, in fact, many parts of Asia intact. It's expressed by the community as a spiritual, as a cultural value, but if you look at it, it's actually these significant biodiversity areas that are actually covered by the sacred sites. So if you put a map and you try to identify within the map all of the areas where biodiversity is still rich and intact, it usually coincides with these sacred sites of Indigenous peoples that are bound up with these cultural values. And so what I want to pass on to future generations and to my children is to recover all of these values so that we go back to the values where we care about the earth and we keep them as stewards, as good stewards for the future generations.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Kimaren, you come from Kenya, and you are a Maasai leader. And as with all of the indigenous territories, your territory was colonized, and yet there has been a strong retention of identity and cultural practices of the Maasai. And I wonder if you can share what are some of these cultural practices of the Maasai that retain that strong connection of lesson about the place and your homeland?
Thank you very much, Peter, and good afternoon. I really want to appreciate Tero for bringing a Maasai to Iceland. From the savannas of Africa to the roof or the end of this world here is a privilege. As I grew up in the savannas of East Africa, southern Kenya, maybe somewhere in the room might have visited the world-famous Maasai Mara Game Reserve. And I come from the periphery of this protected area. And it's one of the testimonies of the experience we've had as a Maasai community. And so as I grew up in this wilderness and with my father hunting livestock, for me, the initial classroom was a landscape, was wilderness, separating which plant is poisonous, which one is good for food, which one, how do you treat the catchment, water catchment, which are equated with motherhood, and so on. And I think, picking from where Jing left, for me, what my father and grandmother in the evening, as they told us stories, imparted on us, is really the positive people-nature relation. For example, among the Maasais, the livelihoods of the Maasai community is mirrored in nature. Like we have totems, so every clan has an animal in the wilderness that represents that clan. And so this relationship with the nature and wildlife becomes a reason for conservation. You can't kill one of your own. And so like my clan is elephant and so on, and others. I also learned that in all the rites of passage, from the ear notching, piercing of ears, removal of teeth, initiation, all through the walk of life, every single rite of passage has a plant involved in it. And so to separate the culture from nature among the Maasai is near impossible. And so I also learned the ways of the different structures of decision-making, the age system, the clan system. So there's a vibrant customary governance arrangement in place to sustain this positive relation with nature. But during the colonial encounter, 60% of Maasai land was lost. And subsequently, with the creation of protected areas, another 30,000 square kilometers were lost for fortress conservation, excluding people. And increasingly, even now, the struggle for survival for the Maasai goes on. But the interesting thing to note is the land taken away has no biodiversity. The little land that was left in the hands of the Maasai is where the highest biodiversity is found because of these positive values between people and nature. And perhaps in the interest of time, I should give the mic back to you. But I want to say, therefore, in conclusion for me, the indigenous communities, the Maasai and others here, represent the future we aspire to acquire. As a developed countries, we need to look back and deep to know where we miss a road. The indigenous way is a way for the future.
Thank you. I want to ask one other question to you. Thank you. So in essence, the indigenous territories on this earth, which are under the collective guardianship of those communities, the indigenous peoples, collective guardianship, they are the sacred places. They are the places that all the world need to be healthy. What kind of support, quickly, do you need from the rest of the world so that you can actually achieve the leadership that you already aspire for?
Well, I think first we are fed up with tokenism. We have had a lot of paper recognition of our rights. If we look at the Convention on Biodiversity, traditional knowledge is recognized. In the Convention on Climate Change, rights in the traditional knowledge is recognized. When you look at the Green Climate Fund, a policy for indigenous people is in place. So what we need is genuine partnership that respects our rights as equal partners and enables us to practically implement traditional knowledge-supported conservation efforts. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you very, very much. And I'm not sure what the flashing 000 means in front of me. Does that mean it's time to go? Okay. Thank you all very much. The one lesson that I would leave with you as you think about the shared knowledge and spirit of indigenous peoples, and this is something I did not know, but I have been taught, is that they share a sense of reciprocity, that they are all human beings and they look at the rest of the world, the rest of Earth, a mountain, a river, an ocean, a reindeer, as a being. And there's a reciprocal relationship between these beings. We take care of you, you take care of us. That's kind of the common wisdom of indigenous peoples that somehow we have lost, and we need to really struggle and work hard to gain. And with that, thank you all for your leadership, for all you are doing for the rest of the world.